Hello, everybody. Um, it is 2 o'clock, and that's when we plan to start our seminar, Visions for Research on Migration Transnationalism. So, welcome, all of you. This webinar is organized by Mitra, and I will be your chair this afternoon. My name is Erik Snel. I'm based at Erasmus University, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Mitra organization, together with Marta Erdal. And I hope she will be here as well. I hope you're here as well. Somehow something is happening at the moment. Here we are again. Okay, Mitra is the standing committee of the larger IMISCOE network, and our objective is to provide a platform within IMISCOE for the exchange of ideas and research on migrant transnationalism. And we are all researchers interested not just in migration or in immigrant integration in the receiving countries, but in particular in the relationships migrants still have with other migrants in other countries. So we are very much into this transnationalism research as part of migration research. What we do, we participate in the annual conference of IMISCOE, and we organize separate events, and such as this webinar and other events, including also PhD workshops. We have a rich tradition of organizing PhD workshops, and sometimes we are able to publish the results of our conferences and seminars in special issues of outstanding migration journals, as we did recently in Population, Space and Place and in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. So we try to publish our results as a standing committee as well. You can find, can I have the next slide? Yes. You can find information about our standing committee on the IMISCOE website. If you're in the IMISCOE website, you go to research and then you push the button of standing committees, and in there you can find information about Mitra, or Standing Committee on Migrant Transnationalism. And in this information, there's also a button if you want to stay connected to us or you want to become a member of the Standing Committee as well. You can just push the button and we will receive your email and your information. I will keep you informed of following events and other things we are doing. Next slide, please. We are also looking for someone who wants to promote the research on transnationalism on social media. So if you are interested in doing so, please contact us, let us know, and you can find information about this position on the event page of PRIO. But please let us know if you're interested to do so. Then our topic of today, visions for research on migration transnationalism. We actually had this idea of this webinar already earlier. We wanted to have a session on the previous IMISCOE conference on this issue, but we didn't do it at the time and thought we'll do it later as a webinar, and later is today. So there are 10 presenters. I will present them in the next slide, but anyway, we asked all of them to give short presentations, 10 minutes each, and try to give an answer to the following 3 questions. How should migrant transnationalism be understood and delimited today? Is it different from previous times, for instance? What is transnational and what is not transnational in the research field of international migration, immigrant integration, and social cohesion? And finally, and maybe the most urgent question, what are the most pressing research questions for future research on migrant transnationalism? We will have these three questions answered by the following individuals, all researchers somehow related to MITRA as a standing committee, and we will ask them all to take 10 minutes to answer these questions. And finally, about the order of the discussion. Of course, you want to pose questions, but we would like to ask you not to use your microphone during the presentations. If you have a question, use the chat function, and we can see what questions there are. And later, you will be invited to post your question, and we can have a discussion. So that's actually what I wanted to say on beforehand, I think. Yeah. And then I would like to give the floor to the first presenter, which is Jürgen Carling.
Thank you.
Here you are.
Good. So I will share my screen with you. Do you see it now, or is it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
But we can't see you.
No. Then you'll have to bear with that. So I'm going first, and I will address each of the three questions head on. But I thought first, since we are sort of taking stock of where does research on migrant transnationalism stand, I just want to sort of situate us historically very briefly. So I looked at articles in 5 major migration journals since the mid-90s and looked at what's the proportion of articles that have been about transnationalism, so that have the word transnational in the title, abstract, or keyword over this period, and how has that changed? And as you can expect, it surged from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. And then there's been sort of a stagnation or a plateau in terms of the number of articles or the proportion of articles in these main journals that engage with transnationalism. And as the sort of total proportion has declined slightly, what's happened at the same time is that while 15 years ago, more than half of these articles that mention transnationalism had the word transnational in the title. Now only about a third of the articles do so. So there's also an indication that people still, in a way, feel the need to locate their research with respect to transnationalism, but that the transnational aspect might not be as central as it was. And that makes it all the more prominent to ask questions like the ones we posed today about how can we actually retain the analytical value of this term. So first, how should migrant transnationalism be understood and delimited today? And I think besides all the sort of scholarly development that we've seen since the 1990s, there have also been empirical developments in the world that makes this a question worth returning to. But I've tried to set up a very basic sort of taxonomy for how we might understand transnationalism and different forms of migrant transnationalism within it. So first, we have to recognize that some transnationalism is migration related, but not all. I mean, like in the journal Global Networks, which has a subtitle, the Journal of Transnational Affairs, there are articles about migration and articles about many other transnational phenomena, for instance, linked to international trade or corporations. So although we are migration scholars, we have to sort of remember that we're not the sort of sole owners of the term transnationalism. And if we then take the step further from the transnationalism that is migration related, we can split it into the biggest part, and which is sort of the typical part that's been addressed, which is transnationalism that is in one way or another a result of migration. So some people migrate, others stay behind, and they remain linked to each other through transnational practices. And that's how transnationalism was understood when it was first defined or coined in the 19th, and that remains very much the dominant perspective. Then there is a second perspective, which we are exploring in a special issue of Population, Space and Place, which is in the pipeline. Some articles are out already, and others, including the introduction, are yet to appear, but they will. And especially in the introduction, we raise this other form of transnationalism, which is not as a result of migration, but as an alternative to migration. So some people who are faced with the difficult choice, should I stay or should I go, opt for doing a bit of both in a transnational way that makes them neither migrants nor non-migrants. So that's one way of approaching it. And then, of course, we can extend this further, for instance, in looking at the transnational connections of people who are not migrants themselves, but descendants of migrants. And we can look at transnational connections not only from migrants to the country of origin, but from migrants in one country to migrants in another country that have the same country of origin, and so on. But this is at least sort of the beginning of taxonomy to try to keep an overview of various forms. Then I'd like to retain these two boxes to talk about the next question, which is what is transnational and what is not transnational in the research field of international migration, integration, and social cohesion, which is the gamut of IMISCOE. I am quite passionate about the non-migrant part of this pair, because I think we really have to understand transnationalism as something that is interactive between migrants and non-migrants, and that involves a kind of reciprocal agency where both migrants and non-migrants play active parts in the transborder activities and relationships between them. This may sound obvious, but it's actually in clear contrast to how migration or how migrant transnationalism was initially conceived in the 1990s, where it was explicitly defined as something that immigrants do, almost in a one-sided fashion, even though the whole idea of transnationalism was about connections back. But certainly agency sits on both sides. I think we have to be attentive to that in our analysis, and also attentive to that in deciding what we choose to call transnational. And there are lots of things that migrants do in their country of residence which don't involve anyone in the country of origin, and which should perhaps not be talked about as transnational, because there isn't that element of reciprocal agency. And I think more generally, in terms of using the word transnational, we have to keep being a bit strict in usage, in the sense that we should use it in a way that also makes clear that some things are not transnational. I think the main pitfall there lies in the use of the terms transnational migration and transnational migrants, which are still found from time to time. And these two terms are deeply problematic, I think, because they raise the question about, okay, so if some migration is transnational, are there then other forms of international migration that are not transnational? Or is it just a way to see all migrants? Or so, yeah, I think those terms really add to confusion around the nature of the transnational. So I would like to cross them out and instead talk about the things that some migrants do and other migrants don't, which are transnational practices and forging transnational relationships. Lastly, what are the most pressing research questions for future studies of migrant transnationalism? I think there are obviously many to choose from, so I have taken my sort of own research interests as a starting point, but I've also gone back to a book that was published more than 10 years ago about mobile phones in Africa, which has one chapter by Jana Burrell with the title, Could Connectivity Replace Mobility? And I think that's actually a crucial question today as well, in a world where we see transnational forms of connectivity rising, but at the same time, barriers to physical mobility of bodies also rising. So to rephrase this question in more sort of targeted ways to this research field. Do transnational practices aggravate or ameliorate experiences of involuntary immobility? So all the people in the global south, especially, who are part of transnational networks in different ways with people who have left but who are not able to leave themselves, how does that how do the transnational practices affect that experience, and what kinds of inequalities, both locally and transnationally, are we seeing emerge as a result of this combination of connectivity and immobility? And I think the current experience that we all have around COVID and the different forms of immobility and connectivity can perhaps give us some new inspiration to address this question. But I'm deliberately drawing upon the COVID experience in that way as a source of inspiration, rather than sort of adding yet another question of how will COVID affect migration in the future, which seems to be on everyone's mind as well. But that's, for me, that's less interesting than this one. Thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen then and hand the word to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Jürgen. It doesn't happen very often in scientific conferences, but we are ahead of schedule. Well, thank you so much for being brief. And I would like to give the floor to Eske Bilgeri from Utrecht University here in the Netherlands. Are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi,
And we
hello
can
everyone.
see you. That's nice.
Hi. I'd like to start with saying that, well, great minds think alike, because I did a very similar exercise to what Jürgen did in terms of the publications, but I'll skip that part of my talk. And also, I'd already like to apologize that I will not be able to stay till the end of the webinar due to other commitments. However, I'm happy that the webinar will be uploaded, right, so that I can check the discussions following our interventions. And considering the great group of speakers that we have here today, I'm confident that it will really be an inspiring one on what transnationalism is and what it is ought to be. So as some of you may know, I've been involved in the former Standing Committee of Migrant Transnationalism since its very beginnings. So back then we were called the IMISCOE Standing Committee on Interactions of Immigrant Integration and Transnationalism in Europe. When preparing my contribution to this webinar, I thought I'd go back to our archives and see what we've been doing over the past years. We have covered migrant transnationalism in many ways, through conferences, symposiums, PhD trainings, and a variety of publications over the years, like Erik also mentioned. Among others, we've tackled migrant transnationalism in relation to return, diasporas, welfare, citizenship, and migration trajectories. However, quite interestingly, I also looked at the very first event that we organized, which was co-organized by Maastricht Graduate School of Governance with Milton Siegel and Gottfried Engberson from Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And surprisingly, the very much the program of that workshop was on the same question that we asked today. It was on conceptualizing migrant transnationalism and integration, and also the methodological approaches to analyze it. So basically, almost after 10 years, here we are asking more or less the same questions. Yeah, so I basically, a bit similar to what Jürgen did, but in a different light, I also looked at the recent publications in major migration journals in the past 5 years. And we skimmed through with my research assistant, Annick Mes, through about 80 articles. And we identified some of the main themes that are targeted. And what we saw is basically, I just wanted to mention them with 3 large clusters. So basically, there's a large focus on study of transnationalism in relation to families, parents, and children, as basically the physical separation of families creates a strong need for social and economic transnational engagements. The second one is the increasing focus on the meanings of transnational engagements in relation to belonging, well-being, homemaking, and multiple identifications. The third one is regarding the questions of mobility, just like Jürgen highlighted in relation to return, and this idea of non-sedentary approach to transnationalism, I would say. So these wide range of thematic focuses, as well as the methodological approaches through which the research are conducted, of course, comes with its advantages. And Morgan also mentioned that migrant transnationalism is often criticized for becoming like a catch-all term that is fuzzy and that it is not delimited enough in a way to make solid contribution to migration studies. Well, in this debate, I would say that I find myself more in the inclusive side and favor more of a definition that requires more of a holistic or more broader definition. And here I would like to say something about the individual level perspective. To me, what is transnational is more than the traditional acts that we talk about, such as return visits and sending money back home. It is as much of a frame of reference, a way of thinking, and a cognition that helps migrants give a meaning to their life, to their social and physical environment, but also something that motivates their behaviors, attitudes, and perceptions. So, and I think here it's important to mention that I think this is something particularly different than multicultural or multinational because of the different layers that are involved. So perhaps I thought I can give you an example that is easy to relate. Of course, it's hard to surpass the period of Corona times. So currently I'm working on a project on the experiences of Asian migrants in the Netherlands. And the project particularly focuses on the experience of Asian migrants in relation to prejudice, discrimination, and stigma, but also more than that, of course. So we've been conducting in-depth interviews, and with my colleagues Maggie Leung from Utrecht University and Rick Dolfijn, also from our university, we found something quite interesting that relates to the discussion we have here today. So basically, in this context, the ways in which, particularly the Chinese migrants, their way of connecting, for example, to the Dutch rules and regulations about corona prevention, the extent to which they comply with them or how they react to them are very much affected by their cultural background, obviously, but also how their social network in China, for example, experienced the pandemic. But it's also about how the Chinese government tackles it, and also how the Chinese government relates to its diaspora in the Netherlands. So even a migrant's way of complying with the rules of social distancing or wearing a mask in the Netherlands is very much shaped by their transnational embeddedness. In this respect, I think more than anything, the transnational lens allows us to see their reality in a much more comprehensive way and give a meaning to their behaviors, expectations, and perceptions. So I think definitely there needs to be much more work on this topic, and that would be my final comment for the final question. We need to kind of theorize more on the transnational embedded cognitions and references and perceptions of migrants. And here I think there's need of more of a connection with multiple disciplines. So I really make a call for interdisciplinary perspectives. For example, in this context, I would say that migration studies, migrant transnationalism can really benefit from the input of cross-cultural psychology, social psychology, and in a way to both benefit from the existing theories, but also to contribute to them. And of course, there's so much more to say in this short period of time, but I thought I would just pick this point to make. And I'm also very glad that as a standing committee, we've taken a broader view on migrant transnationalism, and I hope that we will be able to continue to be a platform for revitalizing our research efforts on migrant transnationalism. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Oscar. I'm not quite sure how long you will be here still, but anyway. Yeah, we nevertheless just go on to the next presenter. Who's already there is Paolo Bocagni.
Thanks very much.
I'd like to give the floor to you, Paolo. Here you are.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon to everybody. Many thanks to the colleagues and friends of IMISCOE and PRIO for setting this up. I think that focusing in depth anew on transnationalism is very important in a way and very challenging in another way, as long as so much has already been written and said over the years. And in a certain way, what we are doing together exactly right now is an act of transnationalism. We are talking about ourselves in a way, what we are doing here and in so many other settings, that is engaging in practices that reach across the distance and make a difference in other settings with other people. In doing so, I guess we both appreciate all the potential this gives us to do a number of things. And to some extent, we have a sense of what is missing, this kind of setting, relative to co-presence, relative to being in the same setting, in the same space and time, which is actually much of what transnationalism means in terms of promises and dilemmas to so-called international migrants themselves, I guess. So how should transnationalism be understood and delimited today? I think it should be understood as at least 5 things at the same time. So as a word, which may be a noun, as it often is, but it could be perhaps more fruitfully be understood as an adjective, which means something that is there sometimes, but not other times, or actually as a verb, as a matter of social practices. At the same time, transnationalism has been clearly been acknowledged as a concept, as a perspective, more broadly, but also as a research domain. MITRA being a case in point of a network of a variety of researchers that are engaged in similar topics in or potentially as much as out of migration and refugee studies. And very last, point 5, transnational is what actually all the former 4 points refer to. So sets of social practices, of ways of experiencing life that have their own evolution over time and space. At a macro level, in my understanding, transnationalism has to do with the effect and the impact of social action from and over distance. How is it that at the most basic people are in a position to exert an influence and receive it towards other contexts, social, cultural, political contexts that do not lie in the immediate scope of their life realm, of their everyday life. There is kind of a remote control metaphor that works to define what transnationalism stands for, I guess. With all the aggregate consequences at the meso and the macro level that this have. We are all familiar then with the dilemmas of narrow versus extensive definitions of transnationalism itself. We may sympathize with extensive definition on one hand, only to find out that whenever we are doing research with some comparative and analytical prospect, we do need some narrowing down, as unpleasant and simplistic as that may be. And we would also agree, I guess, by now that transnational practices are subject to major variation in space and across different scales and in time. Time meaning along the life course of individual people, of migration systems, and of generations of people, one after the other. So, wondering what transnationalism is not for myself, as much as for Jorgen and for many more authors, as much as wondering what transnationalism is. There is still, I think, some risk of holism, of approaching all sorts of migration flows and experience as a transnational by definition, which does not help to make much of a difference and then understanding out of that. There is some need to draw boundaries at some point, as much as there is a need, I guess, to go beyond linear and progressive narratives of transnationalism in itself. The common sense stance, whereby we may be tempted to say that more and more people are engaged and so on and so forth. That's to me much more of an empirical matter. There are ebbs and flows in migrant transnational engagement in many ways. I guess it's also important, although it's much more tricky, to distinguish between practices, observable transactions of a transnational thought and the underlying imaginaries, which have a much broader reach and depth. Again, that may be an oversimplification, but I guess that there is some kind of a turning point in approaching transnationalism in terms of empirical research, in drawing a boundary between what is transnational and is not. And again, the boundary might conceptually lie in finding out whether a given stance, practice, relation, act, or whatever else exerts an observable influence, whether we are able to make a difference to something over the distance or not, to put it a bit bluntly. So, research questions ahead of us. I think that a primary way to approach this is to wonder on what kind of aspects and social phenomena we may still expand furthermore in terms of transnationalism. I think that an obvious but not so much analyzed yet line has to do with the interaction between online and offline forms of communication and interaction, including online and offline forms of migrant transnationalism. Bear in mind once again that migrant transnationalism is only one particular aspect of the world of what we may call the transnationalism in a broader sense. Another field involves cultural circulation, and yet another field on which I may be a bit biased, and I apologize for this, has to do with home and homemaking practices, which is a topic in itself. So research questions to me are three, and then end up with this. First, what is the scope for simultaneity, which is a very emphasized and celebrated condition for transnationalism, which means what kind of infrastructure, material, symbolic relationships, and so forth enable different groups and categories of people to engage in transnational practices as long as they are interested in doing so, which, as far as migrants, is not always necessarily the case. Which leads more fundamentally to a second question, the one that, to me, sociologically speaking, lies at the core of the transnational debate. What functional equivalence, if any, is there between physical absence and social presence? In what ways being present by default in a context far away from me through transnational practice is the same or not as being physically there? Broadly speaking, for instrumental purposes, this is more likely to be the case. For affective and emotionalistic purposes, it is not always so easy. To conclude, I think that the main developments ahead of us for migration studies in transnationalism, but also to some extent going beyond transnationalism, which need not be the last word on anything we are going to research, involves research on temporalities, on immobilities, and on the potential for ICTs to bridge the social distance between people. I guess that's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Paolo. Wonderful. We're still ahead of schedule. I will just pass the floor on to, and your slides already there, Prabhati Raghuram from Open University in the UK, I guess. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting and for putting together. And it's really chuffed to be with a whole list of really great thinkers. So thanks so much for this. So, and thanks also for the earlier speakers. And like Jürgen, I'm really interested in the non-migrants' role in transnationalism. And I'm going to start from actually where he left off on that and ask, what does this mean for current research on migrant transnationalism? So to move on to my first point, if you don't mind. Could you change to the next slide, please? The question here is, how is it that we approach migrant transnationalism? And in asking that, I say, I join other voices who think about what exactly is transnational. And I want to ask, when and where is the border? So in some of the most interesting conceptual work that I've been reading more recently, what I've been thinking through is, for many parts of the world where transnationalism exists, it can be produced in situ without movement. Borders shift around many, many people around the world. For instance, there's excellent work about Chilean politics in the context of a border area. And how do we theorize transnationalism in this context? And about how Dominican Republic and Haiti, for instance, have had shifting borders, memberships of the nation, which have changed as rules and notions of citizenship of the nation have changed. And actually the role of gender tropes within this, how actually the role of women and how women are imagined as citizens and as nationals has changed over time, even though when people have been in situ, right? In effect, to take nations for granted may itself be a remainder from an imaginary of the dominance of the Westphalian state. Much more common in many parts of the world are contested borders and uncertain nationalities. So migrant transnationalism, the nation of the transnationalism, is much less certain. In effect, it is not only the migrant transnationalism that is changing then, but also the nation which is changing. So we need to think through the where and when of the border and to situate the transnational thinking beyond the notion of the Westphalian nation state. And I also want to, in doing that, to think about what's similar about the nation. Is nation a site which you transcend? An economic structure, a political structure, a sense of belonging? How do we conceptualize the changing nature of the nation within this? And what are the different temporalities of these alignments of the trans work? And how do you incorporate the arrhythmic relation between these different versions of the nation, right? The political state, the economic state. These are not necessarily in sync. So the question for the future here is, how do we think about the migrant and migrant transnationalism within the context of the differences and the shifting notion of the nation and its boundaries? So turning then to what is transnational and what is not transnational, the reason why some of this is important, and my own concerns around this have been around the spatialities that actually transcend the nation and do their own trans work. For instance, Mazadra and Nielsen call this the politics of operation, and they point in some ways to questions which we should be asking ourselves, which is, what are the different spatialities that are not based around the nation? So what is the relevant spatiality for each object we study? Crucially, what is the type of transnational relation that is inherent to that kind of stretch and spatial stretch that is happening? They call this extractivism. But how are these relations forged? Are they topographical, hierarchical, topological, like John Allen has suggested? How do these things flow to create inequalities around the trans and across the trans? And how are migrants entangled in these flows? So then I want to move to my second point, which is, why is this important? For me, it is important because in the context of so much of trans work, focusing on the local and not on the trans work is itself a form of claim. It aims to cut free from the overarching logic of global capital as the guiding principle around which some of the best theorizing of trans work has been done, and to look at the local, local capitalisms, local resistances. This goes to the heart of some of the work around decolonization, for instance, and points in some ways to the irrelevance of transnationalism, or the capture of transnational networks to facilitate a often fascist nationalism. So I want to answer the question, what is not transnational, by suggesting another question. When is transnational not the right spatial collectivity being deployed? When is the claim local? That is, in effect, when something is not wholly transnational. It may only be incompletely transnational. And that's why people are able to claim certain versions of locality. And for me, that locality is not a place, it's a claim. And migrants are caught up not only in this, because they are not only rejected from receiving countries and And that's not the only reason for transnationalism, but sometimes they may be rejected from sending countries, right? Localism is abounding everywhere, including through the cloak of ethics. And so moving on to my final point, which is in the final slide, that is, why is this so important? And I hope here it sets the agenda for new research and thinking around this. For me, this localism too is not a solution. Decolonization is many things to many people, but in many ways, what it does do is challenge the transnational forces in all its forms. Interestingly, it also challenges transnational sentiment and transnational processes, including the lived experiences of some transnational migrants. So in ending, I want to focus on another conjuncture, which has really challenged my thinking this summer. And I'm conscious that many people have talked about COVID, but alongside this has been another, crisis, but we should think of this crisis not as a crisis, but as a political conjuncture, which unfolds what lay before and what is to come after. And that conjuncture is the conjuncture around Black Lives Matter. The biggest forms of transnationalism that I'm increasingly concerned with are around Africa as home to Black lives. Working with an African artist, I heard about how transnationalism is imposed through slavery. What he believes is that when he dies, there will be a spiritual homecoming to Africa, and he's actually British Black, but he strongly identifies himself as Jamaican, which is his, which is a country from which his parents moved. He works, but however, on and in the in-between, between these places. The temporalities which have shaped this transnationalism are very long. Yeah, they involve slavery, they involve his parents' lives. But taking this transnationalism seriously makes me think not only about ejection through slavery, but also of return, right? His spirit, he says, will return to Africa when he dies. However, localism can also reject these African spirits. So sometimes my African colleagues will say, aha, but he's not, right? He's Jamaican, he's not African. So localism is not quite enough. These are questions about where and when is African, a question which has got renewed interest with the Black Lives Matter movement. Who is Black, who is African, and so on. These are fundamental questions that have troubled me about who is a migrant and when is the transnational? And I think for me, they open up new agendas around transnational thinking. But I think in this version, I hope there is also a strong political edge. I'm particularly interested, like Jürgen, about where do I stand in this kind of transnational stories? How do I position myself? Because I'm not African, I'm not Black, right? How do I do allyship with these transnational communities? How do I rethink transnational lives within that context, placing myself as both interlocutor and as researcher within these stories? These are questions around the spatialities of ethics. In my own work, I've been thinking about this within the context of decolonization. What I've argued is that the local as claim is not enough. So what I want to say is that taking on a wider ethical stance around transnationalism means holding in tension the trans with the local, not giving up on both or either. And that in this space is where we will find both research questions, but also ethical responses. Many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Interesting. We'll just go on and on. So I will just pass the floor to someone else from the UK, to Paul Statham from University of Sussex.
Hello, thank you very much for organising this panel. It's nice to have 104 people in my living room. That's not usually the case. I'm usually sat here on my own these days. So it's very nice to see you all, and I hope that, and thanks again to the organisers. Yeah, transnationalism. First question then was, how should migrant transnationalism be understood and delimited today? Because one of the people who remembered how exciting it was when transnationalism came out 20 to 25 years ago, to go back to think about the general theories or general perspectives on transnationalism. And it got me around to thinking about how useful is a general theory or perspective on transnationalism, when my own feeling is that the emergent forms and the migrations that produce transnationalism seem to be so context dependent. So I guess what I'm talking about there is perhaps in general a move away from these more general perspectives to specific research questions where transnationalism is studied within a specific context. Now, why would that be necessary? I think that in the early days there was a sort of there was a tendency of searching for the soul of transnationalism. So quite often normative claims asserting and demonstrating the existence of transnationalism, both here and there, as it used to be then. They didn't usually study in between. And I think that was very valuable then, but we need to be aware of academics, whether we've inbuilt some path dependencies there. And, you know, as a journal editor, when you see an article that says I'm looking for a transnational lens, you kind of wonder whether people should be setting the research question and finding transnationalism within that. So I think where we are now is not where we were 20 years ago, and that maybe we need to rethink things a little bit and be aware of what, you know, that we empirically know a lot more about the way the world works, and that it's also moved on in that time. I feel a little bit the same about methodological nationalism, which was a wonderful insight that made, that was a plea for sociological imagination and reflexivity, but I increasingly see it used as a dogma, sometimes almost as a stick to that leads to academic silos where people studying transnationalism don't actually speak to people looking at issues of integration. Whereas, of course, if you study integration, you can be you can put research questions in your survey that ask whether to what degree the transnational shapes the cultural identity, even in relation to questions of social cohesion or that kind of thing. Mostly survey researchers don't do that, but maybe if there was more of a discourse, then perhaps people would do that. So getting back a little bit to these, general theoretical debates, I guess the latest version of that was when Roger Waldinger's Cross-Border Connections drew responses from Levitt, Feist, and Glick-Schiller in this kind of ethnic and racial studies. This was lively. I remember Peggy Levitt's article, I think is called rather sarcastically, "Welcome to the Club." And, Roger Waldinger has played this role in transnationalism of being a critic and then joining a bit and then being a critic. And I think that, I like the book. I like his book. I think it repeats a lot of what we already knew and already understood. But I thought the main contribution was to talk about states and borders, and particularly maybe that's something that the transnationalism coming from its roots as a bottom-up perspective in anthropology, and that hasn't really engaged sufficiently with the idea of states and borders, and the degree to which those shape the degrees and forms of transnationalism that are there. And I thought it was interesting that he aimed this critique at both transnationalism, but also the assimilation integration research of people like Richard Alber, saying that an over-focus on social interactions and how people engage with each other in the social world in both perspectives has kind of meant that they haven't really spoken to each other sufficiently, and that both of them leave out the degree to which access to rights or gaining entry into a state structures people's lives, which, you don't have to be a signed up person of the citizenship regime's perspective to think that. Even the work of people like Nando Estigona and that talks about how people are psychologically structured by the sets of regimes they face. So I thought Waldinger was actually quite useful in introducing pessimism, so you don't get the same happy ends that you get from Richard Alber in terms of integration, or you get from the traditional view on transnationalism, and that this kind of pessimistic view also raised questions about what happens over time, and also this idea of withering away. So when does transnationalism become less? And that basically brings me on to my next point, which is an attempt to address what are the most sort of pressing types of research questions, you know, where do we go from here? And as you can perhaps guess from what I'm saying, that my plea is for more empirical research around specific research questions rather than this applying transnationalism or looking for transnationalism. And I think that one of the most important tools we have here is comparison. And this should be a comparison of contexts that produce transnational forms of migration. And so looking at comparison of the structural factors that produce cases of transnationalism, or what we call the of transnationalism, but also saying why some contexts produce it and some contexts don't, which is quite often missing. There also needs to be comparison of cases of specific forms of transnationalism, you know, comparison across cases. So what factors determine whether something happens or doesn't happen, or how long it lasts. And then even comparison across time of looking at certain forms of transnationalism, what happens to them over generations, or what happens to them over periods of time. And yeah, some of my own work that on cross-border marriage migration, looking at Thais and Westerners, brought some of these issues to my mind. It's a heavily researched area, and there was lots of research on cases that principally focused on interpersonal relations and emotions, motivation. You know, a lot of it really excellent research. But what I did feel, though, was somebody who came from a slightly different tradition, that you know, behind this, as the explaining factor, it was always vague references to global inequalities. And for me, that's not really enough, because it doesn't say why some inequalities in different places lead to transnational activity, either migration or whatever the phenomenon is that we're calling transnational, whereas others that, where the context looks similar don't actually produce that. And so in a way, I think, you know, we need to get back to some of the basic questions that people like Jürgen have been looking at for years, looking at the motivations of why people migrate, also in a different way. Douglas Massey's done the same. But again, looking at these Thai Westerners, I was trying to, which is both ways, migration and connections, I was trying to think then, what are the structural factors that might account for these kind of things? And the first thing I came up with was, you know, you know, why Thai Westerners, why not Vietnamese Westerners, why not people from Myanmar and Westerners? And the first point was that, you know, the dense social networks and cross-border connections that are generated by the massive flows of short-term mobilities. So in Thailand, you have 38 million people moving in and out each year, which is more than half the population. You have cities entirely built for tourism. And so, you know, there is actually an infrastructure of mobility that makes this possible. It doesn't just pop out of the air. Another factor is internal to Thailand, which is Thailand's economic development, and in particular the transformation of the Thai rural, which Jonathan Rigg has written an absolutely brilliant book on, which I strongly recommend. And this, you know, changed gender relations. So there were less children. Women were used to migrating internally, moving to Bangkok. The whole transformation of social norms. And without that, you wouldn't again be able to explain why women started moving around or having the autonomy to do so. And the third factor goes back a little bit to the Roger Waldinger type of thing, that is, although short-term mobilities in and out of Thailand are very easy, when you try to settle there permanently, it's very restrictive indeed. You can't even own property unless you're, you know, if you're a foreigner. And the same, obviously, it's very difficult for Thai people to move to Western countries. So in a sense, what people were calling marriage migration was in many instances something else. It was marriage migration by default because people couldn't move around unless they got married. So it could have been retirement migration, lifestyle migration, care migration, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, Just to bring to a close then, I'm an advocate of comparison. I'm an advocate of contextualized research. And, I think that we need to answer the comparative questions of, why some streams and forms of transnationalism exist and others that potentially could don't. We need to compare different cases of transnationalism to explain the different factors that shape the outcomes that we call transnationalism. And I think that we also need to look at them over time, and particularly this question of when transnationalism ends or doesn't end or transforms into something else across generations, or, that kind of thing. So thanks a lot for your time, and I'd like to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I just want to remind everybody, if you want to pose a question or have a remark about any of the presentations, just please use the chat and we come back to it later. There will also be a possibility to pose your questions live, but there's also this chat, and I see that nobody is actually using it until now. So I would like to go to the next presenter, also from the UK, so Mike Collier, also from Sussex. You're even neighbours.
Yeah, I could walk across the corridor and see Paul, but it's nice to see him in this context. Thank you very much once again to people who've organised this. It's always hard coming towards the end of such an impressive array of experts talking about this topic. It's difficult to work out what can be added. I think I have one or two things to add, but there's also a lot of very interesting connections to what people have said previously. I'd start from a much more maximalist perspective around the understanding of transnationalism than I think most people have expressed so far. I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 30 years of studies that have been explicitly labelled transnational is a maturing into a much broader context, something that we could even refer to as mainstreaming. I would be interested, the point that Jürgen started with about the number of articles which have transnationalism in their title or their abstract or keywords. I would expect that there would be a significant array of articles which took a transnational perspective, or at least had been influenced by a transnational perspective, but didn't feel the need to label what they were doing as such. So a much more mainstreaming approach of transnationalism. That's clearly our hypothesis, that it will be difficult to test at any significant statistical level, but that's certainly the perspective that I start with. And this, in response to the first question, builds on an understanding of transnationalism as an attempt to study and to delimit connections between people and places in other parts of the world, very broadly understood. Whether those places are national places, and I share Parvati's concern about the flexibility of national borders as a stable unit of analysis in this. I think the sort of places that we're talking about might be in different countries, or they might not. We could have a more translocal agenda, which I don't think fundamentally changes the sorts of questions that we're asking. But this attention to these connections and the significance of connections across space really helps us to understand a lot of the changes that have been going on over this period of the last 3 decades or so, around superdiversity, for example. I don't think this is necessarily the case to focus on links between migrants and physical points of origin. That's obviously part of it. But as descendants of migrants become more important, we know that this evolves. I think of work by Bashir Ahmed, a PhD student that Paul and I supervised at Sussex, who finished last year, who was working on political transnationalism of children of migrants in London and Washington, DC, linked to the Horn of Africa. And one of the interesting things that she found was that people often are not motivated by national origin or national forms of belonging, as much as religious forms of belonging, and often defined their engagement in countries that their parents and grandparents were not from on the basis of a sensitivity around Islam, for example. So in that case, religion is a more significant motivating factor than national origin. And I think it's useful to connect this to, I'm a geographer, and certainly as British geographers, one of our favourite points of reference is Doreen Massey. And one of Doreen Massey's most famous pieces of work is around a global sense of place. And I think connecting transnationalism with Massey's work around global sense of places, around the impossibility of understanding anyone or any particular location in isolation, again linking back to Parvati's discussion around the relationship between the trans and the local, I think is really central to this sort of understanding of connections that inevitably exist. So coming to the second question, this leads me to a degree of unhappiness distinguishing between what is transnational and what is not transnational. I can see the value in trying to be as precise as possible about that sort of context. But I think transnationalism is evolving into a particular perspective, and that perspective can give us new information potentially on anything. So it's not to say that everything is transnational, but I think a transnational perspective can provide some sort of insight into almost anything. Ozge mentioned that this group started out as exploring links between integration and transnationalism, a connection which is not immediately obvious. We tend to think of integration as something which happens in places. But one of the articles, one of the books that came out of that, Blanca Garcia's Mascareñas and Renus Penix's 2016 book on integration processes, the introduction to that book sets out this fairly challenging idea, I think, of seeing integration as a three-way process, not just between the groups that are in the place where the integration is supposed to be taking place, but with a broader transnational context as well. At about the same time, I was involved in a project working with resettled refugees in the UK, and we were interested in well-being of refugees in a variety of different contexts. But one of the surprising things we found was that there was a very clear statistical relationship between the way in which refugees reported how positive their relationships with family and friends were in their country of origin, and the way they reported relationships with people in their immediate neighborhood. So that those people who said, my relationships with family and friends in wherever the point of origin was are strong, were statistically more likely to say that the relationships I form here are also strong. So people who feel good because they have good relationships with their family also feel good because they have good relationships with their immediate neighbors. And I think that connection is really important in this context. So even things like experiences of discrimination in this context that we don't immediately think of as connected to transnationalism do have a significant transnational context to it. And I think this marks a maturing of work on transnationalism, that a transnational perspective similar to work on history, historical approaches to migration, on the political economy of migration, on gender and migration. Now, all of these things are started as approaches. They retain a specialized field. There are people who only work on gender and migration, but any study that we do on migration will emit a gender angle to it, then we're missing something significant. And I think that's widely recognized. And I think we're coming to the point where transnationalism will occupy a similar place, where if we study something in a local context, ignoring or overlooking these international connections, then we're missing something significant about that study. So to turn to the final point about pressing research questions, I just think that there's one area here which I'm particularly interested in, and where I don't see very much work at the moment, which is the evolution of transnationalism over time, particularly over decades and generations? How does it change? How does people's sense of place change in relation to these sorts of connections? This requires a longitudinal approach, the sort of approach that we don't often see, or is certainly challenging to operationalize in much social science research. I think this understanding of how belonging to local places is contrasted with much broader scale or long distance forms of belonging over time is a particularly interesting and very fruitful area for future study. But I'll stop there, and hopefully we can get some questions and some discussions between what I think has been a very interesting set of presentations already. So I'll turn over to Marta, who I think is next. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Again, very inspiring. We're still a bit not on schedule. We have some time left, but now Marta Errol will take the floor, and she's actually the main coordinator of MITRA, and I'll just give the floor to her. Here she is. Or at least I thought she's here.
All right, trying to unmute myself while sharing was not as simple as I thought. I'll
Here she is.
go back again. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and thanks, Erik, for somehow managing to keep the time much better than we had imagined. So I hope you can hear and see all right now. Erik, is the sound and the visual okay? Because I can't really see anyone else.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So I think even more so than when Mike started, we're, I think, reaching a point of saturation, which maybe is good. So I'll definitely be touching on things that have been mentioned already. But I guess that's also quite useful to sort of see where we may or may not be finding points of saturation. So I wanted to start my comments with this statement, I guess. So why I think a transnational lens is crucial in migration studies today. And Paul, bear with me, I'll try to justify why I think that phrasing might be useful, although I very much heard what you were saying in your presentation as well. So I think I want to start approaching these questions that we've posed for the webinar today from the angle of what role the transnational might play in relation to our research quite broadly. And I do that very much starting from an assumption, I think, which is quite similar to others who've spoken today, which relates to this sort of empirical reality of transnational ties and of transnational practices, and that these might be very tangible things, cross-border practices where stuff actually crosses borders, but also that there is this slightly less tangible aspect to it, which I think Özge explained very well early on in the interventions. So I think that's a sort of very important starting point, that it is an empirical reality. And I think that migrant transnationalism then as a sort of a lens, in a sense, is useful to perhaps approach by asking some quite basic questions. So that's what I'm going to do. So I think we might want to try and think about this in terms of object of study. So what is the transnational thing that we study, or what is transnational about the thing that we study? So some quite typical examples, I guess, might be remittances or transnational marriage or voting from abroad. And I guess for all of these, it might be quite different how we define what it is that we study about them, and thus maybe what is or is not transnational about what it is that we study in a sense. But I think for all of them, there is a cross-border aspect that is quite clear. There's money that's being sent across the border. For transnational marriages, there might be more of a discussion, but certainly the actual event of a marriage taking place between people who come from different contexts, for instance, could be conceived of as a cross-border event. And for the voting from abroad, there's also a cross-border event happening with ballots being cast across the border. However, I think also bringing out these three examples, it's quite clear that people who do research where these are relevant might in very different ways relate to what is or is not transnational about the thing in a way which they are studying. So I think it might be useful then to think about what is the unit of analysis in our research. I think very often the object of study and unit of analysis have a lot in common. They might be the same, but they might not necessarily be exactly the same. I think for each of the sort of research projects that we might have, it's very useful to actually push this a bit further and to really think about what is the unit of analysis that we are researching. So in the context, for instance, of remittances, is it actually the cross-border money transfer that we're studying, which is the transnational practice as such? Or are we focusing on one or other side of that transaction? Are we focusing on a single individual, for instance, the sender remittances or a receiver? Or the family relationships, which are within a transnational social field and which are being shaped and affected in different ways by these remittances being sent? And I think the same could be said for the two other examples, and I won't go through the moves of doing that. But I think it is at that level of quite sort of nitty-gritty focus that we can get more into depth in terms of this question of what is or is not transnational and how we might want to understand and define that. But I think this point about the lens or the analytical perspective that Mike also was raising, to me at least, is actually really important. And it relates to a point Jürgen made as well in terms of what it is that we want or don't want to define as transnational. And I think I would agree that defining people as transnational is not that useful. There might be instances where that is the case, certainly, but it is rather maybe what people do or how they think about the world, where I think the transnational is mostly applicable and mostly useful. And as such, I do think there is merit to transnationalism as an analytical perspective, but I do agree there should perhaps be boundaries in terms of how far we want to push that. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of the stuff that Mike said, but basically sort of underscoring the salience of this analytical perspective of migrant transnationalism that I think we still are very much in need of. Then trying to push a little bit further with another example in terms of this question of what is or is not transnational. I really do think it is an empirical question. And so in that sense, I think I would agree fully with everything that Paul was saying about sort of future research agenda. We really need to be in context comparatively and really figuring out this on the ground. So I want to draw on one example, and this is a tweet from the Polish government. And it's about a campaign they have, which has a hashtag called the 60 million of us. And I think it's a really interesting kind of thought experiment in terms of thinking about what is or isn't transnational about something and the where, when, where, how, and why of that specifically. So I think in this instance, it's worth thinking about, for instance, what is it that they're doing? This relates to sort of diaspora, I guess, building, integration. I'm not sure it's a strategy. I think it's perhaps more at the level of a tactic, but there's certainly something there in terms of trying to stretch the notion of what the nation in the Polish context is. I think also more importantly, perhaps, it's interesting to think about who the audience of this is. Are these resident Poles or are they non-resident Poles primarily who are the target of this? I think probably both, but I think that's an empirical question also in terms of how does it actually resonate with people who have a Polish heritage who live abroad? And in that sense, is it actually something transnational or is it perhaps political rhetoric at the internal level more than anything else? So I think these kinds of very specific examples can be very helpful in sort of pinning down a little bit more exactly what it is or isn't that is transnational about a specific phenomenon or in relation to a specific empirical question. But I think there are kind of two pitfalls, as usual, I guess. And I think one of them is to sort of ignore the transnational, which evidently is there around us empirically. But I think the other one is to sort of essentialize the transnational and sort of study it up in the air, sort of disconnecting it from the spatiality, which necessarily is always there also, and very often the spatiality which is multiple. So then returning to the question that I wanted to start out with about why I think this transnational lens is so crucial. And let me try and give you three reasons for that quite quickly, and they'll resonate, I think, to some extent with things that have already been raised. So firstly, reflecting on these questions that we posed for this webinar in advance of this while preparing, it it sort of struck me that the zero-sum assumptions that are there in social science and in the public domain in general about culture and about identity, they're so pervasive, but they are empirically unfounded largely, and we know that, and still they're so pervasive, which means, to me at least, that a transnational lens is quite critical and quite necessary in migration studies today, and certainly also beyond that. And then also, as a geographer, I'll come back again to this point about spatiality. So I think, you know, the stuff that we study is always going to be somehow spatially located, at least for most of us. But it's also spatially located in a multi-scalar sense. And I think that's also really important to acknowledge, and that a transnational lens enables us to actually see that. And I could go on about this for a longer period of time, but I think the point is fairly obvious to anyone who's studied any transnational phenomena at all. And I think it could link to the very sort of tangible things, but certainly also to the intangible things. And it has to do with how people understand the world and how they imagine different aspects of the world and how those are connected in their lives, but they're not necessarily within one nested scale, for instance, from the local to the national in one context. So they could be translocal, has been mentioned, and they could be linked to several different contexts in the world at the same time. And there's a scalar sense to that within each person's experience. And the transnational lens allows us to see that, and many other lenses actually don't. So I think we win a lot, in a sense, by having a transnational lens in terms of being able to explore and understand what is going on empirically. And the third reason is methodological nationalism, again. And I could apologize to Paul, but I don't think I will. I actually think it is quite important. Let me try and explain why. So, of course, it's a very long time since these points about methodological nationalism have been made. And I think, I haven't checked, but I think the number of articles that actually cite the different pieces that were written 20 years ago about this are many, and they're probably growing. But I think the point is still not being taken very seriously, and certainly not in mainstream social science. And I haven't done a systematic review of this, so this is based more on impressions than anything else. I think there might be three issues that we could raise from this. And the first one is that in the field of migration studies, especially, there's been a huge growth in the past, 5-10 years. And I think maybe there is a risk that when a field grows very quickly and very many new people, whether they're senior or junior, enter that field, a lot of the kind of wisdom that might have been there 20 years ago and that we could have been building on systematically from there, not necessarily gets taken through. And I think that is a risk. And I think also that a lot of the funding is nationally based, which again sort of might underpin that risk of sort of not learning from what we actually knew before. And secondly, I'm wondering what the political context does. So there is an increase in isolationism agendas. There's also an increase in populism. There is a rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric in general. So how does that affect how we actually study cross-border realities, which empirically are there? But how does it affect how we do that as researchers, as part of mainstream social science, say? And I do think that, again, the sort of methodological nationalism learning points are perhaps not really taken on board in those broad agendas. And then perhaps slightly ironically, and maybe a little bit in a sort of provocative sense, might it be the case that sort of the rise of what was called the transnational turn in migration studies, which perhaps now is ebbing, I'm not sure what Jürgen's graph actually tells us there, somehow creates the idea that migrant transnationalism is for those who are interested in the transnational stuff, and the rest of us can get on with business as usual, keeping ourselves within our nationally contained boxes. And I do think there is a bit of that going on in social sciences and in migration studies, and probably not among the group of us who are here today. So perhaps it's speaking to the choir at the moment here, but I think it is a concern more broadly. And then to end very quickly, I do also have three possible ideas for pressing research questions for the future, and they're not very narrowly defined, but I think they resonate with some of the ones that have been mentioned before. So the first and main one is really this very empirically oriented question of how, why, and for whom do cross-border ties matter, and it links to what Jürgen was saying earlier in terms of, this is not only something which matters for people who we normally maybe would categorize as migrants. There's also the issue of different societies that may or may not be described as origin, transit, or settlement. And I think there are different spheres. So a couple of people also mentioned the political sphere, we can mention the religious, the economic, and so on and so forth. I think the comparative angle that Paul mentioned is also really important here. And then a second point that I think could also be interesting to study with a transnational lens explicitly is the matter of dual citizenship, which is hugely growing. And somehow there is a sort of disconnected literature on dual citizenship, which I guess has a transnational lens, sort of. But it's interesting to see that there are a number of sort of scholarly debates on dual citizenship that are not connected to each other, and they are really substantively connected. So I think those dots need to be connected at some point. And then finally, again, another set of literature which is actually happening. So I guess my plea here would be for more connecting and integrating of different research fields. So illustrating here with a slide from a publication on diaspora humanitarianism, which has as a subtitle "Transnational Ways of Working." So really going into these this issue of transnational ways of doing things, and how that, especially perhaps in relation to diaspora engagements in humanitarianism, which is now studied under the rubric of humanitarian studies as well as development studies, maybe needs connecting somehow back again to the discussions we are having about migrant transnationalism as well. Thanks, I'll end there.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, well, you solved the problem that we are ahead of schedule. That's very good. So I'll ask you to pose questions in the chat, as some of you did. Well, I can read them, but I can also just give the floor to people. And I would actually rather do the latter. So I would like to ask, if you're still there, Dr. Ali Chaudhry from Rutgers University in the US. You asked a question about race and migration. And maybe you could just tell it yourself.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, thanks. It's been wonderful hearing all of your presentations and really interesting points. Yeah, so my question is about the one thing I kind of didn't hear about as much, although I think Pavardi did a bit allude to it, the Black Lives Matter. So it's really around this issue that in general, in migration studies, right, we've kind of created this bit of an artificial separation of who studies race and who doesn't. This is very, very clear in the United States. In my field of sociology, it's quite divided. Of course, there's a lot of places where there's intersections, but I'm curious, thinking about transnationalism as either a lens or as a set of findings, what do folks think about that there's potential here to use our kind of sets of theories and tools to think about why is it that those kind of protests kind of erupted all over the place, right? The situations we have in the United States between the African-American community and policing and the Latino community, they are unique. They have specific histories and they vary state to state, they vary city to cities. Sometimes the police brutality is black police officers doing brutality against black citizens. So it's very complicated here. But there's something about whenever you've got a group that is labeled that they're this, whether they are post-colonial immigrants or they're Muslims or whatever, that they have this kind of descriptive kind of boundary that gets constructed around them, and that when they're face-to-face with another majority society, whether it's white or whatever, that there's conflict. And we see that the state has used the policing in these communities in many countries to kind of keep people in check. So my thought is that maybe there's a potential here for us to get into those conversations with people that are working in race relations and policing to talk about how is transnationalism kind of making this happen. And it's at the migrant level, right? It's migrants that are moving to places, getting their perceptions of who they are, their group, vis-a-vis the police, vis-a-vis other minority groups. So it's all about migration, integration, and transnationalism together, but it's always kind of divided out. So it's more kind of a comment / question. Is there ways to maybe think about making bridges across to other subfields? I'll stop there.
Any of the panelists want to react to this comment? Not specific question.
Do you want me to go a couple of points about it? One of them is that in thinking about Black people as migrants into North America, we forget that actually all the white people are also migrants into North America. And the indigenous people are the ones who have been minoritized. And it's so you could as easily talk about white British transnationalism in the US, right? So very important, therefore, to not think of and this is very much, very much clearer in the case of, say, for instance, a place like South Africa, where the politics around who is racialized is based not through the lens of migration, but actually through the indigenous people being minoritized, right? So, and we've got to make sure that we offer that same lens to the US, because it's no different, right? It's doing the same thing. And they have just treated later migrants, sometimes previous migrants, differently based on color. So, so that's one really response to that, on that relationship between migration and race. But the second response is that absolutely the question about transnationalism has, and this is kind of what I was trying to suggest, is that the questions around transnationalism will have a political edge, whatever it has to respond to the political questions of that moment. And for me, some of those really interesting questions have come in part through the Black history, through the Black Lives Matter, because it made me think, actually, is Black the transnational category here, right? Is race or how is it being claimed as a transnational category, right? And through histories of migration, right? So it's being claimed, and it's really important for people like me who had come into the history of kind of maybe race politics. I had thought of myself as being politically Black, right? But now we know or think that actually it is a migrant Black. It is about histories of over a period of time from Africa that is claimed as a political Black now, and not the same as the political Black of the 1970s or 80s. So it arises from migration, not from politics. And so the current conjuncture takes transnational migrant lives as the basis of politics in a very different way, right? And it raises very interesting questions, therefore, about when we talk about transnational migration, what is the time period over which we are talking, and where is it claimed, right? So very important dialogue here about, do we call people of color or Black or whatever? But these are very much centered around about this relationship between race and migration. So just 2 quick responses.
Marta, I understand.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. I think it's a really good question. I was actually thinking about it as well when I was preparing yesterday, that because we've had in Norway, there's quite a bit of discussion about concepts and traveling concepts, which is also a kind of transnational thing, right? So there's kind of, I think we also had protests here, right? So kind of echoing what was going on in the US and elsewhere. And I think there's at least 3 different ways in which there's kind of potentially transnational links. I think there's a transnational link at the level of anti-racist mobilization. And that goes in terms of kind of, how they actually protest, the forms of protest, et cetera, and that there's kind of a transnational movement thing going on. And of course, social movements are transnational very often. So I think that's kind of a whole literature where we could also kind of gain inspiration here, and which has less to do with the migrants and more to do with that kind of transnational level. And then I think there's a whole discussion on these concepts. So it relates to kind of how concepts travel or don't. And there's been this really interesting resistance in Norway in terms of structural racism, especially. And it's been very interesting to follow, where does this resistance come from? And it's got all kinds of things to do with very sort of local ways of trying to define yourself in the kind of grand scheme of things in the world. And the kind of, which responsibility did we have for the slave trade, which didn't we, all those kind of historical things. As Parvati says, also kind of very long lines of history that suddenly sort of emerge in response to young people protesting on the streets today. So I think there's something very sort of transnational, global in terms of history that comes out there. But yes, I do think it has to do with migrants as well in a very specific sense. And I think what I've seen in Norway is that it's extremely noticeable when people who come from the US or from the UK who are not white meet the Norwegian society, because they have a whole different way of relating to that than, say, do people who come as refugees from an African conflict context. So, I mean, their experiences of racism in the Norwegian society might not be that different, but their way of dealing with them and of interpreting them are very, very different. And those conversations which are going on right now are really interesting. And I think there's definitely things that we should be doing, connecting dots between kind of those those colleagues who are working on those issues and us who are focusing more on the transnational aspects, perhaps. And I think that both sides would gain a lot if we were able to connect. I think that's a very well made point. Thanks.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, one of the first, actually the first person who actually posed the question is Indra. I can't really read your name, sorry. Indra, are you still there and could you pose your question?
Yes, I'm still here and I hope you can hear me.
We can, yeah.
Thanks. I'm an independent researcher based in London, but I did a PhD at SOAS in 2016, and at the time I had the impression, because I was trying to sort of package my thesis as migrant transnationalism, but I felt at the time that there hasn't been any new sort of breakthrough in that literature, given the rise of the research on bordering and borders, which was also very important in my case. And I think Paul has referred to that. So do you share that impression that there's been a lack of response from the field to the rise of the importance of borders and bordering, and relatedly, because a big part of bordering is through immigration policies. How do you theorize the relationship between migrant transnationalism and migrants' legal status? For example, the possibility of permanent residence in the country of destination. Thank you.
And your question was for Paul Statham.
I think anyone can comment. Paul was I think the only one who alluded to it directly, because he talked about the Thai case, which I also worked on.
Yeah, okay. Paul, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it, yeah, although maybe some of my comments were slightly irritating about methodological nationalism and transnational lens, I mean, the point I'm trying to get at is that, ideas have an evolution, and there does come a point when they become or can become dogmatic, and I think that the question that's been raised here is a really interesting one, because if you look at the current sort of cutting edge critiques of integration, sort of integration into what, the kind of work that Adrian Favell is doing, he's trying to put his career into a sort of perspective that's using post-colonial critiques to look at the way that we've seen integration, and part of that is softening the harder way of looking at integration to be inspired by transnational perspectives, so that all migration is all seen as being transnationalism, that kind of thing. So that's kind of one direction of this kind of softening. Yeah, the question was more about this bordering and states and the structuring of life and the categorizing of migrants. And, I think this is an important field where transnational perspectives can become engaged and involved. Kerry Eppen and Marta wrote a very good article that was looking at the interactions between transnationalism and integration a few years ago that's been highly resonant, but, in a sense, it's an agenda setter that should be the basis for people in doing concrete research. Again, thinking about Roger Waldinger and what he was trying to say in this, trying to build a general theory of transnationalism that was different than other people's, even though he drew basically on US-Mexico. I think what he's trying to do is that he refers to things such as liminality and the way that migrant lives are structured by state categories, and that even if you move away from looking at formal rights, the restrictions that exist for people in the way, if you're undocumented, whether you can actually move around openly in the day or those kind of things, this kind of organization of social life that is derived from the way states behave is limiting forms of what could be seen as transnational behavior, or the aspects of transnationalism that we're looking at. So in a sense, I think the speaker has a point, the questioner has a point, that that hasn't been linked up and looked at enough in my view. And I think that, you know, even the work of people like Nando Sigona and or even Alice Block looking at how migrant lives go. I mean, I don't really think that's been linked up with people who define themselves as working on transnationalism. And you know, so how does the bordering, in a sense, structure what transnationalism can be in the post-migration situation? So that would be something that I think would need to be focused on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Karsten Giese about transnationalism and localities. Are you still there, Karsten? And if not, no, he's not. Well, then I propose that we will not discuss the question. Right. Irene. Is Irene there about your question about transnationalism from below?
Hi, I'm here. Thank you for the... Yes, basically I'm working with sub-Saharan migrants in the southern borders of Europe, and how they cross the border and how they record their border crossing with mobile phones, and how these mobile phones are acting as railroads, underground railroads, in a way that they want to record their border crossing and doing decide like transnationalism from below and being their own grassroots diplomats. That's what I want to know about this illegalized or irregularized migrants, especially sub-Saharan migrants into Europe. Thank you.
Is there anyone specific you will ask this question? Okay, anyone want to react? The panel?
I think maybe
I'm happy to try to give an answer to that, but particularly from this sort of very broad perspective that I tried to outline. I think the central question is what does a transnational perspective bring to this? You know, how does it change our understanding of what is going on? And if it doesn't change our understanding of what's going on, then it's not an appropriate perspective to use in that context. And clearly there are different things happening in different places. So the question is, you know, to what extent do these things inform each other? I think the characterization transnationalism from below does assume that there is some sort of transnationalism from above, which isn't always the case. I mean, whether transnationalism from above in this case is the sort of state interactions, the state architecture to control that, or whether transnationalism from above is simply the interactions of migrants who are better resourced to create these connections. And it's I think that particular label, transnationalism from below, requires it's categorizing something against something else, if you like. So then exactly what is it that it's being categorized against becomes a significant factor there. But in many ways, this relates to the previous question around the relationship between transnationalism and borders, and perhaps ultimately to this methodological nationalism idea that that transnationalism, if it is defined as a relation across a national border, is problematic in certain ways for sort of naturalizing the existence of these natural borders. One of the things that is repeated again and again by undocumented migrants is the national borders shouldn't exist, and much of their activities is defined against national borders. So then to reimpose a sort of theoretical understanding based around national borders isn't necessarily the most helpful way of interpreting that. So I think there's a whole range of ways in which transnationalism could impinge upon this, very significant area of research. And those, in my view, are more or less useful and would relate to and bring together different sorts of questions and responses. So it's the way in which we use transnationalism in this context that I think would determine how useful it is or not in that case, if that's the root of this question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Matthias, you also have a question, more general question.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for a very interesting presentation so far. I was just wondering, I had a question to the panel as a whole on your thoughts on the apparent increase in sort of anti-migrant movement transnationalism as well, exemplified by the Visegrad 4 and La Lega in Italy combining forces to close borders or limit cross-European migration cooperation, or the many references to Trump's restrictive border policies among anti-migrant activists in Germany. And I was wondering whether or not you think that these phenomenon challenge the common understanding of how the fields of and the concepts of transnationalism and migration intersect, about it, whether or not it's a new development that's come about because of an evolution in technology, or whether or not it's just sort of the latest examples of a longer standing trend. And I know that Marta touched upon it in her argument, but I open it up to anyone who'd be interested in commenting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Is there anyone from the panel or from the broader audience, of course, who wants to react, answer? Who can I give the floor?
Okay, I can answer if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Can I answer? Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that history matters quite a bit. I think we should remember that when the migration field transformed by the emergence of transnational theories, multiculturalism, the renewed interest in citizenship, when, as Mike said, it kind of went from the margins to the mainstream of social theory and understandings of the world, that was kind of a high point of globalization. And then the world we live in now is shaped by politicians who are reacting to the consequences of that globalization, and that we're in a period of renationalization, reaction to globalization, and in some cases populists who build on what they build on perspectives that address those people who feel that they got left behind in the neoliberal globalization that transformed the world. And that's the world that we are empirically in now, that is different than the one that gave birth to more optimistic views of transnationalism. So I think there's a historical context both to the theories of the world, but also the changes at the level of the social world itself, and what's going on there. So if the question is people studying transnationalism look at these political aspects of renationalization and how those people join up to reinforce borders and reconstitute borders in ways that they weren't before. I don't think it's bringing the past back. I actually think it's something new, but I think it's a thing that should be included within the remit of what transnational people studying aspects of transnationalism do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else who wants to comment? Maybe you've seen in the chat. I mean, if you want to say something or enter the discussion, you can also raise hands or just open your mic, whatever you want. There's a question for Parvati from John. Is John still there? John, oh sorry, Jen Dickinson. Just wear my glasses. Do we still have Jen among us?
Hello, sorry. Sorry, my internet connection is not particularly stable. I was just really interested, Parvati, in some of the politics of this tension between the internationalism and localism that you describe.
You're actually very hard to understand. Yeah.
Between transnationalism and decolonizing? Is that what you said?
Hello, sorry, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my internet connection is pretty bad. I was just interested if you could expand more on the question about the politics of some of these different articulations between the transnational and the local in the recentering of Africa in some of the Black Lives Matter movements.
Okay, so yeah, I have to first say that I have only been an ally, so I really have to say that my position in this is very much from the outside, and I therefore do not have authority to speak. And if there are people here who would like to speak more authoritatively, I think I would like to cede ground to them. If anybody, Lamin, Lerny, anybody wants to speak about this with any kind of sense of what they wanted to say. Okay, I'll say something now, but then I just want to really hold back and say also that it's very much a perspective from the outside. There's been a lot of debates about who is the group in Black Lives Matter, who is the Black in Black Lives Matter, right? And how do we define that? How do we hold it together? It's taken many different forms. So, for instance, in the British case, as in the American case, in the British case, there is some affiliations around the memory of slavery and the British and the role of transnational British actors in producing that slavery, right? So there is, because after all, at the same time where you have transnational Black people being, you have slavery as a transnational practice, you also have, settlement from Europe by white settlers. So these two kinds of transnationalism are occurring at and around the same time, and with different types of extractive politics going on between those. So it is the inheritances of these two different mobilities and migrations that we get in terms of the power of whiteness and how it shaped up in Black Lives Matter. What is the tension here with transnationalism? So I would suggest that there are 2-3 different things. One of them is never to forget that there is also transnationalism of other groups, which is in part in response to what Ali was asking, which is that the white people are also leading transnational migrant lives, and you are not necessarily migrant, but their lives are transnational. Look at Donald Trump and his Scottish golf courses. So it's to be able to call that transnational, to remember that is also coming out of a history of migration, is a political act, right? It is to resituate it beyond the kind of overdetermined, in an Althuserian sense, of how certain kinds of migrants, like the Mexican migrants, get overdetermined as having certain kinds of lives, but then not others. So it's therefore very important. how does all this relate to localism? In my case, and this is just very initial thoughts really, and definitely not a position, is that I think there is something here about the history and role of Africa and thinking about what is the nation, right, in these transnational political movements. So I've become much more conscious of that. I listen to the British Black Studies group, and there are lots of discussions around that, but I don't necessarily contribute to that. In Europe, I think it takes very different forms, however, right? Because the overwhelming and important nature of the history of slavery in defining Blackness, which is so central to British and possibly US lives, doesn't always translate into other countries. It is not because other countries did not have histories of slavery or did not participate in slavery, but it is because they have different forms. They have post-slavery histories, which may be very important. And then you look across Europe, and this has really been interesting in the context of IMISCOE. What we got was, and we have a seminar series starting in January, sort of quick plug here for that, where we're going to think through some of these issues, looking at old colonial countries, new colonizers, and peripheral failed states, and those who stand in a much more liminal position, i.e. those like, for instance, who were both colonized and have colonized in different forms, right? Or who see themselves in a much more interim place. So, and then there is a wider question of, is color, which is seen as one of the basis of these sort of movements, the important thing, or is Africanness? And this is something which a Dutch, that Peter actually, who leads IMISCOE, asked. He said, actually, the big question in Netherlands is Islamophobia. So for me, what I'm trying to think through is as researchers, how do we align ourselves and become allies and not just look at these groups from outside as researchers, but how do we actually, think about how should we analyze this transnationalism in a way that helps these groups actively? I hope that helps. I don't know if it sort of answers entirely what you asked.
Okay. Is there anybody who wants to react on that? So not just research, which we've been discussing now, but also political activism. Is there a role for us as transnationalism researchers? Is there anyone who wants to react to what Prabhati just mentioned?
Yeah, maybe I would just add to what Pavali just said. I think one of the gaps for me still is how do we recognize or incentivize the issue of researchers from the global south, let's say sub-Saharan Africa. Because often when we talk about researches, about some of these areas like transnationalism, and even talk about global south, often the researches from the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa, are lost. They are not seen and they are not considered, leading to most perspectives about these concepts being too, much, from the global north than representing ideas from the sub-Saharan Africa. So for me, I think that will be a good beginning. How do we ensure that we are able to account and, of course, also bring on board perspectives and of researchers from the sub-Saharan Africa to help us better understand these concepts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. As an editor of a major migration journal, could you say something about it?
Sorry.
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, I mean, in the journal, what we try to do is over the last number of years is to globalize, and we've actually, with special issues, gone out and tried to recruit people to do special issues on the global south and including global south scholars. So yeah, is there a problem here? Yes, there's absolutely a problem. It's structured into academia and the way universities work. It's structured into every aspect of the social world that we live in. And yeah, in terms of academia, yeah, we have to do more to try and include people from different regions of the world into the mainstream debates that have been predominantly dominated and continue to be so from North America and Europe, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. One can do small practical things to try and address those issues, but a lot of the issues there are structural, and yeah, on the ground in a small way we try and support things. We've even spoken to publishers and tried to campaign to make you know, even provide open access to certain regions of the world, which they do, but it's apparently, I recently learned that it's not as universal as I'd been told it was, so that's you know, that's not as great as it could be. But yeah, I think we have to acknowledge this as an issue. Sorry, my phone's got my class in the garage. I knew that would happen. Yeah, so I'll finish with that point. And thanks, Lamin, who's one of our students on the MA at Sussex, for raising those issues, which I think it's always important to have restated in meetings like this.
Thank you so much, and good to hear that there is openings also for publications from other parts of the world. It is 5 to 4. Officially, we will end the session about at 4 o'clock. So there will be room for 1, maybe 2 final questions. Is there anyone who wants to add something, or one of the panelists who want to react on the other panelist, or whatever, something to come up?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. I'm Loeni Santana from the Dominican Republic. And I have a question about how we can address integration and transnationalism issues between two countries in conflict. I'm thinking about it, not about, I'm not talking about war, but for example, within Dominican Republic, between Dominican Republic and Haiti, there is an historical conflict caused by the heritage of the colonialism in our island. And thinking about what Poverty was talking about, I think like if transnationalism is related with integration, what we can address those conflicts with this lens of how people can have connection or not between two countries in conflict.
Okay, thank you for this question. Yeah, there has been some research about social connections between people living in different countries who are in conflict with each other. So maybe one of the panelists is familiar with this kind of research. Want to add something, or
Michael, I think you said that you've been working on this in the African context, and it would be great to hear from you.
Thanks, Bhavati, for putting me on the spot. I've unfortunately got to run. I've got another meeting at 3 o'clock, but and I don't think we could start to answer this question in 1 minute, I'm afraid. But it's a really interesting area, and certainly it is something that I mean, amongst other people here, I have thought a little bit about. But yeah, thank you very much, and thanks very much, everybody. I'll take the opportunity to say goodbye and head off. Have a good afternoon or evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your contribution to this event. Okay, I will then would like to turn to Marta Erdam. She is still there. She's organized this meeting. Here you are, Marta. Is there anything you want to say to close the meeting? Or maybe what we will do with the proceedings of the meeting, the event? Or about Mitra, anything?
Thanks, Erik. Yes, I guess first of all, thanks to all the panelists for agreeing to participate, and also to everyone who's attended. We've had quite a few people who were there for a very long time, and I've seen now that more and more people are having to leave, which is very natural. I think a 2-hour webinar is a risky endeavor, but I think we've done reasonably well. So there is a recording of this, and it will be posted on the IMISCOE website. As we don't have a participant list from this event, we won't be able to share it with you guys, but you've already seen it, so I think that's fine. But if anyone wants to kind of go back and recap, it should be available on the IMISCOE website and certainly posted under the Migrant Transnationalism Standing Committee. Probably elsewhere as well, I don't really know, but definitely under there as well. And then in terms of further engagement with our standing committee, if you are interested, I'd recommend you to follow us on Twitter. I think that's the most efficient way of keeping up to date with what we're doing. Otherwise, also on the IMISCOE page, as Erik mentioned, there is some information there about how to get in touch with us. But I will be open with you in saying that right now there's not a lot of action going on. We're trying to find our feet in this Corona virtual world. I guess a natural point to mention there is the deadline for the IMISCOE conference, which will either be physical in Luxembourg, 7th to 9th of July, or if that is not possible, then it will be a virtual event as well. So if you're interested in engaging, that is also another opportunity which will be coming up. But mainly just thank you for participating to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this concluding words, Marta, and I also thank all the presenters and the whole audience. A lot of people who listened to us and discussed with us the issues of transnationalism, and we hope to see you again somewhere around in any other meeting or event, Mitra. So thank you so much.
And thanks so much for your sharing, Erik. Thank you. Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.